I never imagined that my son-in-law would steal my credit card and try to arrange my murder. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Back then, before all the trouble with my son-in-law, life rolled on in that gentle, familiar way it does when you've been keeping house for most of your life. The kind of quiet you earn, not the lonely kind, but the peaceful kind that comes after years of washing school uniforms, running little fingers under the tap when they'd burned them on the stove, and patching up knees and hearts. I suppose I'd gotten used to it, my routines, the comfort of my own rhythm, and the way the morning sun would sneak through the kitchen blinds just so, right onto my bread box. I started most days with a pot of coffee, 2 scoops of Maxwell House, and a whisper of cinnamon just like my mother used to do. The radio would be murmuring softly in the background, Frank Sinatra or Patsy Cline if I was feeling wistful, which was more often than not since the house got quieter after the kids moved out. I'd shuffle around in my slippers, tending to my little garden out back, pinching off dead leaves, humming as I went. There was a sweetness in that simplicity, let me tell you. Family was everything. My daughter and her husband, yes, the one this story is about, lived just a few streets away. My grandkids would come over on Saturdays, running through the screen door with grass stains on their jeans and popsicle drips on their cheeks. I'd always keep extra snacks on hand, because a grandma's purse is never without a cookie or two, even if it's just store-bought. They'd plop down at the kitchen table, chatting about school, trading little secrets, and more often than not, asking for just one more slice of my apple cake. I trusted my family. I truly did. I was the type who kept my checkbook balanced to the penny, never hid the sugar bowl, and would have given the shirt off my back to anyone who asked, especially family. My son-in-law, he was a fixture in our world. Always busy, always talking, always with some new big plan. We thought he was charming if a little too smooth around the edges. He liked to talk about all the things he'd earned in life, and maybe I should have noticed then how he said it, but I didn't. I wanted to believe the best. That's a flaw of mine, I suppose, or maybe it's a gift depending how you look at it. Now about my company card. Oh, that thing. See, when my late husband passed, he left me with the business. Nothing big or fancy, just the hardware store we'd run together for years. I never wanted to let it go, partly because I liked the routine, and partly because I wanted to keep his memory close. The store was our legacy in its way, and the company card was for business expenses only. Supplies, gas for the old delivery van, holiday turkeys for the staff. Strict rules written down in the notebook I kept next to the phone. I suppose looking back, that's where it started. The trust. The ease of it all. I never thought I'd have to keep an eye on my own family, not with something like that. I remember the last day before the trouble started as clear as the blue-checked curtains above my kitchen sink. It was a Thursday, I think, or maybe a Friday. The grandkids had been over, we'd baked oatmeal cookies, and my daughter called on the phone, her voice bright with that busy mom energy. "We'll swing by tomorrow, Ma. Need anything from the store?" I told her no, just bring yourselves, maybe a loaf of bread if she remembered. That night I stayed up a little later, sorting through old receipts, keeping the books as I always had. I remember feeling proud in a quiet way of how far we'd come. Everything was in its place. My little empire of flour canisters, the checked linoleum under my feet, the humming refrigerator, and the familiar comfort of family not too far away. Sometimes I wish I could bottle that calm and hand it out to anyone who needs it. The peace before you know there's a storm on the horizon. You don't see the clouds yet, just a clear blue sky and the gentle ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. If I'd known then what I know now, maybe I'd have hugged everyone a little tighter that night. Maybe I'd have asked a few more questions, or paid more attention to the tiny things. The way my son-in-law's eyes flickered when I mentioned the business account, or how he always laughed a little too hard at his own jokes. But that's the trick of hindsight, dear. Life doesn't let you know you're living through your last truly peaceful day until it's already gone. All I knew then was warmth, the smell of cinnamon in the air, and the feeling that my little world was safe, tucked in tight around me like a well-worn quilt. So there it was, the calm before the storm. My life, my home, my family, and that company car just waiting for the first ripple to disturb the water. And I, blissfully unaware, humming along, thinking I had all the time in the world. Oh, how quickly that peace can be shattered. But that's for another day, honey. For now, let's just linger here a moment longer, in the quiet, before the trouble begins. I can still picture that first Sunday dinner when my daughter brought him into my kitchen. A gust of cold air trailing behind them, the kind that always makes the curtains flutter and the dog bark from his bed by the stove. He stood there, tall and sure of himself, grinning as if he owned the place. That's the sort of entrance that stays with a woman, especially one who's spent decades watching all sorts of folks come and go. He was my daughter's new husband, her catch, as she said with a nervous little laugh, and she looked at me, her eyes bright as if asking for approval. He was younger than I'd expected, with slicked back hair and hands that looked too soft for real work. He wore a suit to my kitchen table. Imagine that, a suit on a Sunday in April, just to eat my pot roast and mashed potatoes. Most men I knew would never risk gravy stains on a silk tie, but he seemed almost eager for us to notice. I suppose I was charmed, in that cautious way women of my generation always are, watching for the cracks beneath a smile. He shook my hand too hard, squeezing as if to prove something, and he called me Mom. Right from the start. That's a little forward for my taste, but I let it pass. My daughter had that nervous way about her, tucking her hair behind her ear, watching him instead of me, waiting for him to speak first. She'd never done that with her high school boyfriends. I noticed it, but I said nothing. That's what mothers do. We all sat around the table, my old checkered tablecloth spread beneath the good dishes, steam rising from the roast, the rolls still warm from the oven. He told stories. Oh, did he love to talk? About how he'd built his first business from nothing, about working 3 jobs in college, about earning every cent the hard way. He had that way of making every story end with him as the hero. We listened, nodding, not wanting to be impolite. He was quick with compliments too. Told me my gravy was the best this side of the Mississippi. Said the house had real character. Complimented my old wedding china, even though one cup had a chip in the rim. And yet, when my grandson reached for a second biscuit, he frowned just for a second. Flicker. Like he wanted to be the center of the meal and the table. Little quirks at first. He didn't like his food to touch on the plate. He refused the creamed corn. Can't eat yellow vegetables, bad luck, he said and winked, but I'd never heard such a thing. He'd talk about his days working construction or finance or sales depending on the week. I'm a self-made man, he'd say, pride swelling in his voice as my daughter nodded along. Everything I have, I earned myself. He made a point of saying it often, and I wondered who he was trying to convince, us or himself. He was generous with praise but stingy with his time, always checking his watch or stepping out to take a call. He'd leave the table mid-meal, come back with a new story, and always ended up talking about money. Money comes and goes, he'd say, but you can't let anyone take what's yours. I thought it was odd, the way he needed to remind us. My late husband used to say a man who brags about money is usually trying to hide how little he has. But Lord help me, I wanted to believe he was good for her. He made her laugh, and she hadn't laughed like that in years. She seemed lighter with him, like she was hoping we'd all get swept up in his charm. The grandkids loved his magic tricks. He'd pull a coin from behind their ears or make a quarter disappear, and they'd giggle until they hiccuped. Still, there were things I noticed in the way only a mother does. He never offered to clear the table or help with dishes. When I offered him a slice of pie, he asked for 2 with extra whipped cream, but left half of it untouched. When I mentioned the old hardware store, my little business, his eyes lit up just a bit too brightly. Must be nice, he said. Having something of your own like that. And then he laughed, but it lingered just a second too long. I remember that first Sunday after they left, the house settling back into itself, quiet as a church after the last hymn. I stood at the sink, hands in the warm suds, replaying every moment. I told myself it was just nerves. New people always bring a ripple, don't they? I was grateful my daughter had found someone. I wanted to believe he meant what he said, that he'd earned everything himself, and that maybe, just maybe, he'd be the kind of man who'd help shoulder the weight of the world for her. But as I dried the last plate, I caught myself staring at my checkbook on the counter, the company card peeking out from the stack of receipts. Something inside me stirred. A tiny worry easily dismissed. After all, what was the harm in trusting family? The sun was setting, painting the kitchen in gold and rose, and I told myself, as I have so many times before, that everything was fine. That sometimes a new face at the table is just what a family needs. If only I'd known then, dear. If only I'd trusted my instincts. But that's how trouble comes into a house. It smiles at you from across the table, asks for another slice of pie, and leaves its napkin folded just so. And you don't see the storm coming until the wind rattles the windows. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That first Sunday we were all still smiling. You know, there's a special kind of comfort in routine. The little things you do without thinking. Folding towels warm from the dryer, counting out the coins in your purse for the paperboy, keeping the pantry shelves just so. I'd spent a lifetime running my house and my little hardware store by the books. I was never the type to lose track of a penny, let alone $1. Maybe that's why I noticed when the smallest things started to shift, like a picture frame just a little off-center. It began with the receipt. One morning I was sorting through the mail at the kitchen table. My glasses perched on my nose and the sunlight creeping across the tablecloth. Most of it was the usual: coupons, the electric bill, a postcard from my friend Ruth down in Arizona. But tucked in between was a thin slip of paper, almost lost in the stack. A receipt for a purchase at a liquor store on the other side of town. I frowned, puzzled. I'm not much of a drinker. Never have been. Not since my wedding day, when I had a single glass of champagne and wound up with a headache by dinner time. First I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe it got mixed in with my store receipts. Or maybe I'd left the company card in the wrong wallet. I tucked the slip into my apron pocket, meaning to ask my daughter about it later. But you know how busy life can get. There's always laundry, always dinner, always something to mend or dust or bake. I told myself I just misplaced it, and went about my day. But then another came. This time, a small charge at a fancy bakery I'd never heard of. Not the kind of place I'd shop. Not when I can make a dozen cinnamon rolls from scratch for the price of one little tart behind their glass case. And then a receipt for a florist one town over. I love flowers, don't get me wrong, but I grow my own in the back garden, and I've always said the prettiest bouquets are the ones you cut yourself on a sunny morning with dew still on the stems. I found myself double-checking my purse, my pockets, the stack of receipts by the phone. I even asked my daughter gently if she borrowed the company card for something small, maybe a school fundraiser or a treat for the kids. She shook her head and smiled. "Not me, Mom. Maybe you forgot?" She said it kindly, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of worry. I let it go. After all, we all forget things from time to time, especially as the years pile up. But that little voice in the back of my mind, oh, it grew louder. I'd wake up in the night and remember another odd charge, or spot a new receipt in the mail. Sometimes it was for gas at a station across town, sometimes for dinner at a restaurant I'd never set foot in. It was always small, never enough to set off an alarm, just enough to make me feel like I was losing my grip. There's a special kind of shame in doubting yourself. I started making lists of purchases, of errands, of every little thing I did with that card. I checked my pockets before bed, wrote down every trip to the market, every jar of nails I bought for the store. I even started to wonder if I was finally getting old in that way people talk about, where things slip out of your mind and you become a little forgetful. I blamed myself more than once. I told myself maybe I'd lost the card, or maybe the bank made a mistake. But then as weeks rolled by, the charges grew little by little. Always just enough to notice, never enough to call the bank and make a fuss. I mentioned it to my son-in-law once, while we sat in the living room after supper. He just laughed, warm and easy, and said, "Oh, you know how those companies are, Mom. Always trying to nickel and dime you." He patted my hand and turned on the television, flipping past the news with a wink. I remember feeling foolish for bringing it up. He had that way about him, making you doubt your own worries as if you were just being silly. "Don't sweat the small stuff," he'd say. "Life's too short." And the way he said it, I almost believed him. Still, I kept the receipts, tucking them in a shoebox in the linen closet just in case. I didn't tell anyone. Not my bridge club, not my sister, not even my daughter. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of an aging mind, or maybe a sign to let go and trust the people you love. But deep down I knew. The little signs are never just little, not when you've spent your life paying attention. They're the ripples before the wave, the first creak in the floorboards before the whole house shifts. I tried to ignore it, to carry on, to keep baking and gardening and loving my family the way I always had. But sometimes, sweetheart, the smallest sins are the ones that grow roots in your heart. And once they're there, nothing's ever quite the same again. It was summer by then. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. I spent my days dusting shelves at the hardware store, or out in the garden with my old straw hat, talking to the marigolds like they were old friends. My evenings I still tried to fill with the small comforts: fresh cornbread, a crossword puzzle, a phone call from a neighbor. I tried not to let the receipts pile up in my mind, but that calm was starting to fray thread by thread. At first it was just the noise. More laughter from my daughter's house at odd hours, more cars parked out front than I could count. One night I sat at my kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching headlights flash across the driveway, doors slamming and voices rising in drunken shouts. It wasn't just family anymore. It was people I didn't know, strangers coming and going, music loud enough to rattle the glass in my windows. The next morning I found another receipt tucked among my mail. A pizza delivery 2 towns over, charged to my company card. That made no sense at all. I hadn't been to that town in years, not since the kids' soccer tournaments. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the paper soft and thin, like the skin on the back of my hands. I told myself it was nothing, but that's a hard story to believe, especially for an old woman who's kept a tidy ledger all her life. Then it began to snowball. My son-in-law grew bolder, coming by the store in the middle of the day, sometimes with a friend in tow, always in a rush. He'd slap me on the back, call me Ma, and wink. "Just need the card for a second, business stuff. You know how it is." Once I caught him glancing at my checkbook while I was counting the register. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, the kind that doesn't go away with tea or aspirin. It wasn't just purchases anymore, it was the late nights. My daughter would call, her voice bright and fluttery. "Oh, Mom, we had friends over again last night. Just celebrating." He closed a big deal. She sounded tired, though, and I could hear music and laughter behind her words. I tried to visit, but every time I did, the house was in some state of recovery. Empty bottles on the porch, pizza boxes in the trash, my grandkids tucked into bed at odd hours. One night, the phone rang just after midnight. I answered, bleary-eyed. It was my grandson whispering, "Grandma, can I come stay with you? Dad's having friends over again." My heart broke a little. I put on my robe and slippers, drove over in the dark, and brought him home. He curled up on my sofa and slept soundly, a peacefulness I hadn't seen in him in weeks. After that, the spending grew. There were receipts for catering, for party supplies, for liquor in quantities that would have made my late husband's head spin. Every time I asked about it, my son-in-law brushed it off. It's just a little fun, Ma. Don't worry, it's all covered. He'd flashed that easy smile, but his eyes darted away from mine. Odd phone calls started coming too. Strangers asking for him by name, voices muffled and rushed. Once, a man called demanding to know when the money was coming through. I hung up, my hand trembling, and stared at the phone as if it might bite me. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every odd charge, every unexplained withdrawal. I was raised to mind my own business, but sometimes your business is the only thing you have left to mind. The shoebox of receipts in the linen closet grew heavier. I stopped sleeping through the night, lying awake and listening for the sound of cars outside, wondering if I was imagining it all. My daughter stopped coming by so much. When she did, her eyes were rimmed with red and she smiled too quickly, asking if I was okay before hurrying away. She wouldn't meet my gaze, wouldn't answer questions. The parties grew louder, the purchases bolder, and my peace, the quiet, steady comfort I'd built for years, felt like it was slipping away grain by grain. One evening, as the sun set behind the pine trees and the air went cool, I stood in my kitchen, holding another strange receipt, the voices from their house drifting through the open window. Laughter, shouting, music. I realized in that moment that what was being taken from me wasn't just money. It was trust, and maybe even my place in the family. It was a quiet, creeping theft, and it was happening right in front of me. I thought of the company card, tucked away in the kitchen drawer, and my hand shook as I closed it. My home didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like a house waiting for the roof to cave in. That was when I knew deep down that this was no small matter. My suspicions had grown roots, and the storm was no longer on the horizon. It was right outside my door. If you've lived long enough, you know how stories can stretch. A small success becomes a legend at the dinner table. A slip-up becomes a harmless misunderstanding. But with my son-in-law it was different. He spun his stories with such confidence, you'd almost want to believe him. Even when your heart told you not to. He took to bragging. At first it was little things, how he'd closed a deal, or made a killing on some investment. He'd slap my grandson on the back and tell him, "You've got to work for what you want, son. I built everything I have with these two hands." He'd wink at me like we were sharing a joke, but I didn't laugh. What bothered me wasn't just the boasting. It was the way the rest of the family began to believe him. My daughter would sit by his side, nodding and smiling, her hand on his knee. Even my grandkids started repeating his words. "Dad says you gotta hustle, Grandma. Dad says nobody ever gave him a thing." I'd swallow hard and force a smile, but inside it stung. The receipts kept coming. Restaurant bills, big ones now, and new clothes charged to the card, brands I never could have afforded, not when I was young, not even now. One afternoon I found a bill for a bottle of champagne. Nearly $200, and my hand shook so hard I nearly dropped the mug I was holding. I remembered when a loaf of bread cost a dime, and here was a single bottle of wine costing more than my weekly groceries. I tried to talk to my daughter gently, as a mother should. I sat her down at my kitchen table, poured us both tea, and reached for her hand. "Honey," I said, "I'm worried about the spending. Things don't add up." She pulled away, her face clouding over. "Mom, please. He's got it under control. He's a provider. You don't understand business the way he does. You worry too much." Her words, sharp as vinegar, lingered long after she left. My son-in-law didn't like that I'd brought it up. That night after supper, he cornered me by the back door. "You don't need to meddle, Ma. I know what I'm doing." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let me take care of things. You just relax and enjoy yourself." The way he said it, like he was doing me a favor, like I was a child. What made it worse was how he carried on to others. One evening, I overheard him on the phone, boasting to his own son-in-law. Imagine that, both of them standing out in the yard, drinks in hand. "Nobody ever handed me a thing," he was saying, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "I take care of this family. I'm the reason we're all living so well." He laughed that big, hollow laugh of his, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Even when I tried to reason with him to remind him of the responsibility that came with family money, money that wasn't even his, he'd brush me off. "It's all under control, Ma. Just let the men handle it." The lies grew. The kids started asking for new things, little luxuries they'd never had before. My daughter started showing off too: designer handbags, new shoes, fancy hair appointments. I knew those little extras weren't coming from hard work alone. Once, at a Sunday dinner, my son-in-law announced to everyone, "It's thanks to my smart investments that we're able to take that trip next month." My daughter glowed, the children cheered. No one looked at me. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, remembering every penny my husband and I had pinched and saved to keep that business afloat. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth, but I didn't. I just smiled and served more potatoes. I tried one last time one night after the dishes were done, just him and me in the kitchen. "You're playing a dangerous game," I told him softly. "That card is for the business, for the family, not for parties and gifts." He leaned in close, his voice low. "Don't worry about it, old lady. You're not going to be around forever anyway. Let someone else have a turn." That cut me deeper than I let on. I stood there, trembling, watching him walk away, so sure of himself, so proud of his lies. I saw finally the truth. He didn't care about the family or the business or even my daughter. He cared about the show, about keeping up appearances and keeping the money flowing no matter who got hurt. That night I sat at my kitchen table, the shoebox of receipts by my side. The lies were growing, twisting their way through my family, turning us into strangers. I made a promise to myself right then and there. I would not let him ruin everything I'd built, not without a fight. But oh honey, it hurt to see the people I loved most believe those tall tales. That's the thing about family lies: they take root, and they bloom where love used to grow. If you ever want to see a family fall silent, just wait until someone rolls up in a brand new car they can't possibly afford. That's exactly what happened the afternoon my son-in-law strutted into our driveway, beaming like he'd won the lottery. It was a Saturday, the kind with heat shimmering off the pavement and cicadas rattling in the trees, and I was inside making lemonade, wiping my hands on my apron when I heard the commotion. I peeked through the curtains and there it was. A car so shiny and big it looked like it belonged to a movie star, not to anyone in our family. My grandkids were already running circles around it, hollering, "Look at this, Grandma! Look at the leather seats!" My daughter stood by the front walk, her face a strange mix of pride and worry. He marched right up the steps, keys dangling from his fingers, sunglasses perched high on his head. "You like it, Ma?" he called, voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Picked it up myself, brand new, top of the line, all the bells and whistles. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood with my hand braced against the counter, heart pounding in my chest. I knew what a car like that cost. I'd seen the ads on TV, and I'd also seen the growing stack of credit card bills in my desk drawer. $100,000 at least, maybe more. The number echoed in my mind, bigger than anything I'd ever spent on myself, even after a lifetime of work. He saw me hesitate and flashed that wide, showy grin. "You don't have to worry, Ma. I earned this. Hard work pays off." He winked at my daughter, who looked away, twisting her wedding ring with trembling fingers. My stomach dropped. That car wasn't a reward for hard work. It was a warning sign, as bright and blaring as a siren. The party receipts, the late nights, the unexplained checks. All of it added up to this moment, and I knew deep in my bones where the money had come from. The family gathered around, neighbors peeking out from behind their blinds. My son-in-law opened the doors, showing off the wood trim, the touchscreen dashboard, the little refrigerator in the back. The grandkids oohed and awed. My daughter tried to smile, but her eyes shimmered with tears she'd never let fall in public. I pulled him aside, quietly, out of earshot of the others. "Where did the money come from?" I asked, voice shaking. "Tell me the truth." He scoffed, waving a hand. "It's all taken care of, Ma. I told you business is good. You worry too much." But I didn't believe him. Not anymore. The truth hung between us, heavy and sour. I knew my company card had limits, strict ones. That kind of money, that sort of purchase, wasn't just irresponsible. It was criminal. My husband and I had started the store with little more than hope and hard work, saving every penny, counting out cash at the kitchen table after dinner. The thought of that legacy being used for a toy, for something so flashy and empty, made my heart ache. Dinner that night was quiet. My grandkids asked if we could ride in the new car to get ice cream. My daughter said no, her voice flat and thin. My son-in-law sulked at the head of the table, picking at his food, already bored with his new prize. I sat there, fork untouched, remembering the days when a used station wagon was the height of luxury for us. Later, after the dishes were done and everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the kitchen, the company card laid out in front of me. The weight of what had happened settled over my shoulders like a winter coat. I realized that the man I'd welcomed into my family, trusted with my daughter and grandchildren, had betrayed us all. He'd spent money that wasn't his, lied to our faces, and dragged our good name through the mud. But most of all, I was heartbroken. Not just for the money, but for the trust I'd lost, for the way my family had splintered. The storm I'd felt on the horizon was here, rattling the windows and threatening everything I'd built. And that, dear, is the moment I knew there was no turning back. The trouble had come home, parked in my driveway for everyone to see. There are words that settle softly on the heart, and words that slice straight through it. The worst ones, I think, come not from strangers, but from the mouths of those you once trusted most. It was after the car, after that uneasy dinner, that my son-in-law started showing his true colors right out in the open. It started small. He'd toss little barbs my way during family gatherings, jokes at my expense, about my old-fashioned ways, or how I still wrote checks in the grocery line. I'd laugh along, not wanting to cause a scene, but the children would look at me and then at their father, confusion knitting their brows. One afternoon, my daughter tried to comfort me. "He's just joking, Mom. He doesn't mean anything by it." But there was a sadness in her eyes. She wasn't fooling herself and she wasn't fooling me. But the worst came late one evening, after the rest of the family had left. He'd stayed behind, leaning in the kitchen doorway while I put away the last of the dishes. The radio was playing low, a slow Patsy Cline tune, and the sun had long dipped below the horizon. He stood there, arms folded, watching me. "You know," he said, voice flat, "you ought to get your affairs in order. You're not going to be around forever." The plate in my hands nearly slipped to the floor. I turned and looked at him, really looked, into those eyes I'd tried so hard to welcome, the man I'd trusted to care for my daughter and grandchildren. There was no warmth left in him, just a cold calculation. He went on, quieter but sharper. "There's a lot that needs sorting out. The house, the business. Best not to leave a mess behind." He smiled, a mean little smile that never reached his eyes. "We all know it's coming sooner or later." I'd heard people say cruel things before, but nothing quite so deliberate. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Like I was a problem to be dealt with, not a person who had poured her life into making a home, raising a family, and building something out of nothing. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea, staring at the pattern on the linoleum, hearing his words echo over and over. "You're not going to be around forever." The next day, I found myself watching my back, jumping at small sounds, wondering if he might go further than words. I started noticing things, my pills out of place, the back steps slick with oil, my car keys not where I left them. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe it wasn't. But the feeling that he was trying to push me out of my home, out of my own story, settled in my bones like a deep chill. That's when I knew, dear, that what I was facing wasn't just selfishness or carelessness. It was something meaner, something dangerous. Words once spoken can never be taken back. And his words left a mark on my heart that I'd never forget. You know, when you've lived as long as I have, you get a sense for when something's wrong, not just a little off but bone deep wrong. After that night in the kitchen, after those cruel words, I couldn't shake the feeling that my son-in-law wasn't just careless or greedy. No, it felt like he wanted me gone. Maybe not right away, but soon enough. I started to notice things no one else seemed to see. My medicines, carefully lined up on the window ledge above the sink, were out of order one morning. One bottle was missing, only to turn up later in the back of a drawer I never used. A new slick of oil appeared on the back porch steps, though I just cleaned them myself. My reading glasses vanished, only to reappear in the laundry basket days later. I know I'm not as sharp as I was in my 20s, but I wasn't losing my mind. These things didn't happen by accident. My daughter grew even more distant. I could see the worry on her face, the way she flinched when her husband barked her name or brushed past her in the hallway. She avoided my gaze when I asked her if everything was all right. Her answer always the same. "It's just stress, Mom. Don't worry." One day, as I passed by the living room, I overheard hushed voices behind the closed door. My son-in-law was on the phone, voice low and urgent. "Yeah, it'll be soon," he said, his words sending a shiver straight through me. "She's not doing so well. Don't worry, I've got it handled." I stepped back before I could hear any more, my heart beating like a rabbit's. That night I lay awake in bed, the dark pressing in on all sides. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. I remembered stories from long ago. Widows swindled, old folks helped out of their own homes. I'd always thought those were just tall tales, things that happened to other people in other towns. I started keeping a notebook under my pillow, writing down every odd thing I noticed, the misplaced pills, the slick steps, the words I overheard. I didn't want to tell anyone, not yet. I wasn't sure who I could trust. But the worst moment came one afternoon, as I was baking bread for the grandkids. I heard a loud thump from the garage. When I went to check, I found the gas knob on the old heater turned all the way up, hissing quietly. The smell of gas made my head spin. My son-in-law appeared behind me, smiling too wide. "Everything all right, Ma?" he asked, but his eyes were cold. I shut off the gas and forced a smile, but inside I was trembling. That was when I knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, this wasn't just carelessness. He was trying to scare me, maybe even worse. The house I'd built with love was turning into a place of secrets and fear. I locked my bedroom door that night, a habit I'd never had before. I whispered a prayer for courage and promised myself I would find proof, no matter what. If you've ever felt the cold shadow of someone plotting against you, you know it chills more than the skin. It settles in the soul. There's a saying I used to hear at church suppers: give someone enough rope and they'll hang themselves. I never liked the sound of it, but sometimes life is just that blunt. That's what happened with my son-in-law. He'd gotten so used to fooling everyone, so used to the easy lies and the way people looked the other way, that he started to slip. It happened on a Tuesday, as plain as any other. I was at the kitchen table sorting bills when the mail arrived. In the stack was an envelope from the car dealership, addressed to business office. That struck me as odd. I'd been in that dealership before, back when my husband and I bought our used pickup, and they'd never sent business mail to our house before. My hand shook a little as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a bill for the new car, bold as brass, financed in the name of my company, using the business card as down payment. It wasn't just a family problem anymore. This was company property, business fraud, plain and simple. And there it was in black and white with my name, my business, stamped right at the top. I sat there, heart pounding, the world narrowing to that piece of paper. All those little purchases, all those receipts, they'd been bad enough. But this was a federal crime. He'd dragged my small hardware store, the business I'd poured my life into his web of lies. My hands shook so hard I nearly spilled my tea. I thought about all those stories on the news about people losing everything because they trusted the wrong person. I never thought it would happen to me, but here it was. That afternoon, my son-in-law came swaggering into the kitchen, whistling a tune, like he hadn't a care in the world. He saw the bill in my hand and froze for just a second. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look afraid. "What's that, Ma?" he asked, two casual eyes darting. I held up the letter, trying to keep my voice steady. "You used the company card. You put the car in the business's name." I watched his face carefully, saw his mouth twist in annoyance. He shrugged, tried to play it off. "It's just paperwork, Ma. The dealership wanted a co-signer. Everybody does it." But he couldn't quite meet my eyes. For the first time, his smooth words didn't sound so convincing. The cracks in his story were showing, plain as day. Later that week, I overheard him bragging on the phone, too loud and too proud. "It's just the old lady's business card, no big deal. It's not like anyone's going to care." He laughed, but it was the laughter of a man who's starting to realize the walls are closing in. I took that envelope, along with my box of receipts and my little notebook, and tucked them away in my bedroom. I knew I finally had proof, not just of carelessness but of real, prosecutable wrongdoing. That night I lay awake, the letter pressed to my chest. I thought of all the times I doubted myself, blamed my age, or let him talk me out of my own suspicions. No more, I promised. He'd made his fatal mistake. It was my turn now. Sometimes the truth takes its sweet time coming out. But when it does, it's sharp and clear as morning light. And ready or not, I knew I had to face it head on. That envelope from the dealership sat on my nightstand for 3 days. Every time I passed my bedroom door, I'd see the corner peeking out beneath my reading glasses. It felt heavier than it should. Heavier than all the receipts and suspicions that came before. But it was the proof I needed, and the weight of it slowly transformed my fear into something fiercer. Resolve. I grew up in a world where women weren't always expected to speak up, especially not to men in the family. But something about growing older, about seeing your life's work threatened, shakes the shyness out of a person. I spent an afternoon at the kitchen table, going through every receipt, every odd charge, lining them up in neat rows. I used my best handwriting to make a list: date, amount, what it was for. By the end, my hand ached, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I knew I couldn't do this alone, but I also knew I had to be smart. So I called a friend from church, a woman named Mabel who'd been a bookkeeper most of her life. She came over with a lemon pound cake and a hug, and together we pored over the evidence. Mabel didn't say much at first, but when she looked up, her face was tight with anger. "You need to see a lawyer, Marietta. And soon." So I did. I called an old friend of my late husband, a lawyer who'd always sent us a Christmas card, even after my husband passed. I dressed in my best blouse, pressed my slacks, and carried my shoebox of evidence like it was pure gold. Sitting in that office, I felt a little silly at first. But when I started to explain, showing him the receipts, the car bill, the pattern of lies, I saw his expression change. He listened closely, taking notes, nodding gravely. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "this isn't just a family squabble. This is embezzlement. This is fraud. And if your son-in-law keeps going, he could ruin your business, your credit, everything." He told me exactly what to do. Freeze the company card, notify the bank, change the locks on the business accounts. He helped me write a formal statement and promised to contact the authorities himself discreetly to start the process without drawing attention just yet. When I got home, I felt shaky but lighter. For the first time in months, I wasn't just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I was doing something, fighting back, not just for myself but for the legacy my husband and I built, For my daughter, for the grandkids who deserved better than this mess. That evening, my son-in-law came by as usual, expecting dinner and a soft word. But I met him at the door, standing as tall as my old bones allowed. "You won't be using my card anymore," I said quietly. "And if you have anything to say to me, you can say it to my lawyer." He stared, surprised, maybe even a little afraid. For once, he didn't have a story ready. He left without another word. After he was gone, I sat down and wrote everything out again in my journal. Not for the courts, not for the lawyer, but for myself. Sometimes the only way to reclaim your story is to write it in your own hand. That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I felt the smallest glimmer of peace return. I wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. But I wasn't alone anymore either. And that made all the difference. Once the lawyer made his calls, things moved quicker than I ever could have imagined. For months I'd been living in that fog of doubt and fear. But suddenly everything became sharp and urgent. Questions, signatures, polite but firm men and women in pressed suits. It started with a knock on the door. Not the kind that signals a friendly neighbor stopping by with a pie, but a brisk, no-nonsense rapping that makes your heart drop into your shoes. 2 officers stood on my porch, one in uniform, one in a dark suit. "Mrs. Carter?" the older one asked. "We need to ask you a few questions about some recent transactions on your company account." I invited them in, hands trembling just a little, and poured them coffee because some habits never die. I showed them the receipts, the notebook, the envelope from the dealership. The detective listened quietly, his pen moving swiftly as I spoke. When I finished, he looked me in the eye and said, "You did the right thing, ma'am. This isn't just a family matter. This is a serious crime." The words landed hard. Even though I'd known it, hearing it from someone official made it all too real. A few days later, the bank called. They'd flagged the company account, froze it, pending investigation. My lawyer kept in close touch, letting me know what the authorities needed, what to expect next. There were more phone calls, more paperwork, questions I never thought I'd have to answer. "Did you authorize this purchase? Did you approve this transaction?" Over and over I explained my son-in-law had access, I trusted him, but no, I hadn't given permission for any of it. The whole ordeal spread through the family like wildfire. My daughter was shocked at first, but the truth has a way of cracking through even the thickest denial. She wept on my shoulder, apologizing for all the time she doubted me, for not seeing what was happening right under her nose. As for my son-in-law, well, he tried to bluff and bluster his way through just like always. Claimed it was all a misunderstanding, said he'd make it right. But when the investigators showed him the paperwork, when they explained the seriousness, federal charges, prison time, public record, his confidence finally faltered. The law was bigger than his ego. There were court dates, depositions, endless meetings. I spent hours in waiting rooms, clutching my purse, thinking of my late husband and how he'd have handled all this. My lawyer reassured me, telling me I'd done everything right. The officers checked on me from time to time, making sure I felt safe. For a while I dreaded every phone call, every ring of the doorbell. But as the investigation wore on, I began to feel something else, relief. All those months of secret fear and confusion, of watching my world unravel while pretending everything was fine, were finally over. The world knew the truth now, and I wasn't alone in carrying it. The hardest part was watching my grandchildren try to make sense of it all. "Why is Daddy in trouble?" they asked, eyes wide and uncertain. I held them close and said the only thing I could. "Because everyone has to tell the truth, honey. Even grown-ups." In the end, the law didn't just bring justice for me. It shone a light on all the shadows that had crept into our family. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And through it all, I held my head high, knowing I'd stood up for myself, for my family, and for the memory of the good, honest man I'd built my life with. When all was said and done, after the hearings, the signatures, the tears and apologies, our family looked different. My son-in-law was held accountable, as he had to be. There were court dates, community service, and a shame that finally silenced his boasting. He lost the car, the money, and the right to call himself a self-made man. The law is slow, but it comes, and it came for him. My daughter and grandchildren stayed with me for a while, our house full of the small noises of healing, laughter at the breakfast table, the clatter of games on rainy afternoons, and the soft, honest conversations that rebuild trust one day at a time. I mourned what was lost, not just money but innocence, and the blind comfort of old trust. But I found something else too. The strength that comes from standing up for what's right, even when your hands tremble. If I could give one bit of advice, dear, it's this: never doubt your own instincts. Listen to the quiet voice that warns you, even when others try to hush it. Love your family, but keep your wits about you, especially when money is involved. The sun still comes up, gentle and gold, over my little garden. I find peace in the smell of bread baking, the weight of a grandchild's hand in mine, and the knowledge that even the darkest storms can pass.